In 2006, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Lawrence Wright staged My Trip to Al-Qaeda, a one-man play that explored the moral dilemmas he encountered while researching his best-selling book, The Looming Tower, Al-Qaeda and the Road to 9/11. Now Academy Award winner Alex Gibney is bringing Wright's off-Broadway show to HBO on September 7th. Wright joined POTUS to talk about his documentary. We began with his first trip to the Mideast decades ago when he taught at American University in Cairo, and how those early years shaped his current views on Al-Qaeda.
Well, in 1969, I was a conscientious objector to the Vietnam War, and I got a job in teaching English at the American University in Cairo, and I had no idea really even what language they spoke. I didn't know that we didn't have diplomatic relations with Egypt at the time, and there were only a couple of hundred Americans in the whole country trying to run this university. And so I arrived in the middle of the night and taught my first class the next morning at 9 o'clock, and that was my introduction to the Middle East. I spent 2 years in Cairo. I made a lot of friends. I learned some Arabic, and all of those experiences were important to me when it came time to consider writing about 9/11 and what had actually happened.
In the beginning of the film, there's a scene of you preparing to go on stage, and you're in your dressing room, and you're sitting down, you're looking in a mirror, and you're putting on what I believe was perfume, a Middle Eastern perfume. I thought that was an interesting scene, so I wanted to ask you if you could talk about the man that gave that to you, Jamal Khalifa, and talk about who he was and what, if any, dilemmas you faced as a result of your relationship with him.
Well, I lived for 3 months in Saudi Arabia while I was preparing my book. I was mentoring these young reporters at the Saudi Gazette. And when I got to Saudi Arabia, the whole country seemed to have this particular odor, kind of a sandalwood, rosewater smell. And it turned out to be this cologne that all these Saudi guys wear. It's called oud. And one of my sources, who became a friend, Jamal Khalifa, gave me a small vial of this. Jamal was one of bin Laden's brothers-in-law, and he was bin Laden's closest friend, and we got to be very close in many respects. I mean, he was a terrific source for me. For instance, he was married to bin Laden's favorite sister, and as a very conservative Saudi woman, she would never agree to talk to a Western reporter or even meet me. But as one of Jamal's 4 wives, each 4th night he would go to visit her, and he would often take questions from me to interview her for me. So the next day he and I would talk, and he would give me her responses. It was incredibly useful. And Jamal was killed a few years ago in Madagascar. He had a mining business there. I don't know. No one was ever arrested for his death, and his family thinks that he was killed by U.S. Special Forces, and that may be true, but there's no way of actually knowing that.
One of the recurring themes in the documentary seems to be humiliation, as we'll hear you talking about in this scene.
9/11 taught us how vulnerable we are. The fear and humiliation we felt following the attacks led us into a dark corner of our own nature. That is the territory Al-Qaeda seeks to capture. It's a place where ideals and aspirations disappear.
We're talking with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Lawrence Wright, who staged My Trip to Al-Qaeda. It's now a new documentary exclusively for HBO, airing on September 7th. Talk about that scene, if you would, Lawrence. What did you mean by the dark place and also the theme of humiliation that's in your writings and in this documentary?
Well, humiliation is a word that is one of the most frequent in bin Laden's vocabulary. He uses it all the time. And it's true that many Muslim men have been physically humiliated in these very repressive governments that they live under. Ayman al-Zawahiri, for instance, the number 2 man in Al-Qaeda, the doctor that was always at bin Laden's elbow, he spent 3 years in an Egyptian prison where he was physically tortured, as many of them were in that Egyptian prison. And I think that accounts for the kind of appetite for blood and carnage that is so characteristic of Al-Qaeda, that physical humiliation. But when bin Laden uses the word, bin Laden was never physically humiliated. He was the son of one of the most prominent families in Saudi Arabia. He was a rich boy, and he had never had any experience like that. What he's talking about is a kind of cultural humiliation that resonates with many Muslims who feel that Islam has been displaced from its proper place in the world. And bin Laden is speaking to that sense of loss. I think that we maybe in the United States have felt some humiliation ourselves because of what happened to us on 9/11, and the rage that comes out of that feeling has created a very dark place inside our country, and I think it's reflected in some of the debate that's going on right now having to do with the place of Islam in American society.
Well, I wanted to ask you that, what your feelings are as someone who spent a significant part of your adult life in the Middle East, about the current controversy that's going on with regard to the proposed community center near Ground Zero.
You know, I have several thoughts about this. First of all, you know, when I was the co-writer of this movie, The Siege, and it was attacked by various Muslim groups for being anti-Islam, and I know what it's like to be in the center of this kind of controversy. I think that some of the political figures that are waving the nationalist banner remind me of the radical imams that were taking the cartoon controversy in Denmark and spreading it around, making it an issue, and with fatal consequences. People died because of that controversy. I worry that this could have that kind of consequence. At the same time, there is a concept in Islam called fitna, which means discord or chaos. And one of the injunctions in that religion is that one should not stir up fitna because it's bad for Muslims and it's bad for Islam. And we now have fitna on a massive scale, and I think that the promoters of the mosque might consider the kind of discord that this particular proposal has generated. So on both sides, I think that they have forgotten how much damage they might be doing.
What do you think the United States should be doing with regard to its policy about the rise of Al-Qaeda post 9/11?
You know, I think the best thing that we have done in terms of our relations with the Muslim world since 9/11 was the last election we had, where whether you agree with the outcome of it or not, it modeled nonviolent social change, which is what we really do want to stimulate in many of those countries that we're now in war against. So that's the first thing, is to be true to ourselves and emphasize the best of American values. Secondly, I think we have to remember that our best ambassadors to the Muslim world are American Muslims, who comprise the richest Muslim community in the whole world, including Saudi Arabia. They're the most successful by any measure of any group of Muslims in the world. And part of that is because they live in a country where they're free to express themselves and free to advance themselves. And that is a story that we simply haven't gotten out. I think that's in the long term, the solution to healing America's relations with Muslims around the world is demonstrating the fact that Muslims in America live freely and are able to enjoy the comforts and the protections of our Constitution. That's the kind of world that we'd like to have for Muslims everywhere.
I'm curious, do you know if your documentary has been seen by anyone within Al-Qaeda, and if so, what they think of it?
I don't know. I do know that when The Siege came out, that according to a source of mine, that it was used as a training film by some radical groups inside Al Qaeda, and I also have heard that it was used by the CIA as a training film for people coming into the agency. So I suppose that both sides have the use of those kinds of materials, and I expect that this documentary will face something like that.
What are your hopes for the documentary?
I want people to understand where this movement came from, and I also want Americans to look at it and consider how we have changed as a people since 9/11.
It's a fascinating movie. My Trip to Al-Qaeda debuts exclusively on HBO September 7th. Lawrence Wright, it's been a pleasure to have you on POTUS, and I want to thank you so much for joining us.
It was a pleasure, Patrick. Thank you.